All right. Good evening, gentlemen. We have here new copies where we're going to start chapter 10 inside the Tanya today, God willing. Chapter 10 of the second part of Tanya. Take and pass here. For you. Chapter 10 continues off of chapter 8 and chapter 9 as we discussed at length last week. Last week's class was a review class. It's highly recommended that anyone who feels lost or anyone who doesn't know what's going on in this section of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah can check back in on the recording of last week's class. Because last week we explained that Tanya, the second part of Tanya, describes two different types of Ein Oid. Two different types of there is nothing other than Hashem. The first type says that everything other than Hashem is nothing. The second type says that everything other than Hashem is one with Hashem, the ultimate something, right? The opposite of nothing. And Tanya, the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, really deals with both of these subjects. In chapter 10, we are reading the culmination, the conclusion of the idea that things are one with Hashem. We are discussing Hashem's achdus, the unity of God, and particularly the idea that Hashem's traits, his character traits, such as Hashem's wisdom, Hashem's kindness, and Hashem's will, all of these things are absolutely one with Hashem. There is no distinguishing these things from Hashem whatsoever. And this discussion began by asking, how can Hashem be called wise if Hashem is not a mental phenomenon, right? And we explained at great length, how much is Hashem not a mental phenomenon? How much can Hashem not be understood? That to even say you can't understand him is to lower him down, is to insult him, because to say you don't understand him is to imply that he's something that someone or some wisdom can understand. And the truth is that wisdom, understanding God, is like your hands touching or holding something spiritual, right? They simply exist in different planes, in different universes, different dimensions. There's no intersection between wisdom, understanding, seichel, intellect, and Hashem. Hashem is not a being within the bounds or graspable by intellect. On the other hand, the Torah says Hashem is wise, right? This sent us down a path of trying to understand this idea. And we explained, how does it work? Well, we explained how we can't really understand how it works, but what does that mean? Why not? Because we said Hashem expresses himself in wisdom. Wisdom is not just another creation. This is very important, as we're going to see tonight, God willing. Wisdom is not just another creation. It's not just another thing that comes from him, like an elephant or an apple, right? Wisdom is something that expresses Hashem. It's an emanation. We said it's nimshach v'netzal. It is drawn forth or emanated from Hashem. In other words, he is expressed in this wisdom, and his wisdom expresses him, even though he is infinitely above wisdom, including his emanated wisdom, right? Even though he is infinitely above seichel, even though he's infinitely above wisdom or intellect, he has an emanated intellect that expresses him. And this is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to understand. And we went further and explained that the difference between him and his intellect are really tzimtzumim, contractions, the divine self-concealment. You have Hashem as he is, and then he contracts and he hides himself, and this produces something as finite, something as defined as intellect, as seichel. This is what we refer to as the knower, the knowledge, and the known, after the tzimtzumim, which is the knower, the knowledge, and the known is a different way of saying that Hashem knows everything by knowing himself, which is a different way of saying that we cannot understand Hashem, we can only understand what he's not, right? All of that is in his contracted or his limited expressed wisdom that comes after the tzimtzumim, after he conceals himself. That is the place where he and his knowledge are absolutely identical. When we say there's achdus Hashem, that the knower, the knowledge, and the known, that he and his wisdom and the object of his wisdom are all absolutely one, totally indivisible, they're identical, that is after this tzimtzum, after this act of contraction. How is it possible that they are absolutely one and yet it is after an act of contraction and self-concealment? Very, very difficult, if not impossible, to understand. We said that he and his wisdom are one, and not just on his terms, but on his wisdom's terms as well. In other words, as we explained, I believe 2 weeks ago, his wisdom itself expresses what? That he cannot be expressed in wisdom. That is what his wisdom expresses, right? His wisdom expresses that he cannot be expressed in wisdom, which is a contradiction. And yet it is nevertheless true. It is nevertheless true. This is why we said at the end of chapter 9 that his spheres, such as his wisdom, his emanations, his emanated traits, such as wisdom or kindness, are what are called by the Zohar, Raza de Mehemnusa, the secret of faith. Because they themselves are an expression of faith, right? They themselves cannot be understood. We cannot understand how Hashem is infinitely removed from his wisdom and yet expressed in his wisdom. How his wisdom can express that he himself is infinitely removed from wisdom. That is something that we cannot understand. We can only know it on faith, right? A different way of saying this, which is equally contradictory, is that because they have nothing in common, that is why they are one. It is because his wisdom cannot express him that it expresses him, right? Because they have nothing in common, right? That's why they're absolutely one. This is something that only the soul can know through faith. This is not something that the mind can understand rationally. His wisdom is just as incomprehensible as he is, in other words, because it's absolutely one with him. And the nature of that unity is as beyond understanding as he is. So the grand conclusion was that the Rambam is right. God and his wisdom are absolutely one, but only after these tzimtzumim and in a way that cannot be understood. Even more than the Rambam said it couldn't be understood. In fact, it's not just that it can't be understood, it's that it's actually beyond understanding. It's beyond even saying I can't understand them, because ultimately his wisdom is one with him. Chapter 10, strangely, although as we'll see it's not so crazy as it first appears, chapter 10 takes this idea which we just said we can't understand, and it gives us a metaphor to understand it. Can't be understood rationally. The first thing the Alter Rebbe does is he gives a mashal, he gives a metaphor to understand it. So let's read inside. We're going to be page 960. Right at the beginning, chapter 10. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, Ach b'kol makom, nevertheless, in other words, even though I just told you that his wisdom can only be known through faith and cannot be understood in the mind, Hayel v'dibre Torah kalashon b'nei Adam, since the Torah speaks in the language of man, l'shachech es ha'ezen ma shehi yechela lishmeya, in order to please the ear. He translates here modulate for the ear, which is an amazing translation.
It's a good translation.
What it is unable to hear. In other words, the Torah tries to make comprehensible sometimes even things which cannot really be comprehended. Right? Lakach nitein rishus. Therefore, permission was given lachachmei ha'emes to the those who study the wisdom of truth. In other words, to the Kabbalists. Good evening. L'daber b'sfiros b'derech mashal, to speak allegorically of the spheres, to speak with a mashal. What is a mashal? Maze mashal. Mashal means parable, allegory, or metaphor, right? But what is a metaphor? It's really fundamental because as we've seen in this class before, at various times, Chassidus is very, very interested in the concept of a metaphor. The concept of a metaphor itself is extremely profound. In fact, we are by Hashgacha Pratis, by divine providence, we are learning this class in the month of Elul, and almost all of the Chassidus in the month of Elul about this month is concerned with a metaphor of the Alter Rebbe. And the Rebbe actually has a sicha where he explains what the month has to do with the idea of a metaphor. Why is everything so involved with metaphor? Because it's a month that is concerned with the very notion, with the very idea of a metaphor. So what is a metaphor, 101? The Alter Rebbe is saying the Kabbalists are given permission to teach about the Sfiros with metaphors, right? We have to point out immediately that no metaphor can capture the Sfiros. No metaphor can capture God's wisdom. Why? For the very reason that we just explained, it's above intellect. Being above intellect means that you are above metaphor. It follows one from the other. If you are above understanding, you are above metaphor, right? Because all understanding is really metaphorical, right? To understand something rationally is essentially to understand how things fit together, how different pieces fit together, right? The cup is white and the table is white and now the ceiling is white as well. So they're all white, they all have something in common. And by seeing what these things have in common, right, by comparing them one to the other, I get a sense for what whiteness is, even though their whitenesses are not identical, right? If you actually look at the whiteness of these three things, they're not actually the same color, although they are all white, each in a different way, right? So it is by metaphor that we connect these things together and we gain a rational understanding of what white is and how whiteness is found in different objects, right? Essentially metaphorical. What happens in a world without metaphors? What happens when you break free of this ability to tie things together metaphorically? Everything exists only in itself, right? Everything is incomparable. You can't compare what's in A with what's in B because there is no making metaphors. This state of everything being only itself is called Lamaila min hachachma, above intellect, above understanding. Right? That's essentially what it means. And we just said that Hashem's wisdom, despite the name, don't be fooled by the name, Hashem's wisdom is beyond understanding. Therefore, you cannot truly make a metaphor for Hashem's wisdom. Right? What's the answer to the question, what is Hashem's wisdom like? And the answer is, it's like nothing. It's like only itself. How do I know? Because it's absolutely one with Hashem. And what are you going to say Hashem is like? Right? So there are no real metaphors. There are no real metaphors on their own in the way that regular seichel works. What I'm telling you now really is qualified because the truth is that the Torah's metaphors are very different than the metaphors that we make in daily life. They don't work exactly the way I'm describing with the three objects that are white. It goes much deeper than that because Torah Torah cheats by being outside of the system itself. That's a whole other discussion. Generally speaking, this is how metaphors work. So when the Alter Rebbe says that since the Torah speaks in the language of man, Kabbalists have permission to make a metaphor for Hashem's wisdom, right? What does that mean? It means even though none of these metaphors really contain within them the nature of Hashem's wisdom, which is impossible. Hashem's wisdom is contradictory, above intellect, and beyond metaphor. Nevertheless, the Kabbalists were given permission to compare, right? They were given permission to say, here's this thing which is not Hashem's wisdom, explicitly not Hashem's wisdom. It's not the same thing. Right? And yet, there is something about it that compares. There's something about it that is related to, that has a resemblance in some sense to Hashem's Sfiros, right? So now the Alter Rebbe is going to give us the metaphor. All right. What is the metaphor? V'karu eisan eres. They called his emanated traits, such as his wisdom or his kindness, what did they call them? Lights. Kedei shal yedei hamashal zeh, in order that through this metaphor, yuvan lanu ktsas, we will understand a little bit inyan hayichud shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu u'midos, of the union of God and His traits. Wait till you hear what the metaphor is. Shehu b'derech mashal, I'm halfway down 961. Shehu b'derech mashal, what is the metaphor for the union of God with His traits? Ke'en yichud hashemesh shebeseich guf kader hashemesh. Like the union of the light that is within the sun, im guf hashemesh shenikro ma'or, with the sun itself, which is called the luminary. It is the union of the ray of the sun in the sun itself. This should sound very familiar, extremely familiar to people who have been coming to this class for a long time, because we have had this metaphor before. This was our metaphor way back in chapter 3. Who remembers what it was a metaphor for? Back in chapter 3, way back. No cheating.
I think it was the other day.
It was definitely more than one day, that's for sure. For sure it was more than one day.
I remember that one.
The ray of the sun in the sun, right? Let's review again. It's important because basically for the rest of tonight's class, may I borrow someone's watch, please? For the rest of tonight's class, we are going to be explaining why the similarities and differences between what the Alter Rebbe is saying here to what the Alter Rebbe said back in chapter 3, even though it's the same, seemingly the same metaphor. Thank you very much. Let's review what we were talking about way back in chapter 3, right? Way back in chapter 3, we had just finished chapter 2. Chapter 2 said that the universe is really only an expression of the word of Hashem, right? Hashem says, let there be a firmament, and it is those words which is constantly creating the heavens. And the truth is that if he stopped speaking the heavens into existence for even a second, they would absolutely cease to exist and return to absolute nothingness like before the 6 days of creation, right? That's what we said in chapter 2. Chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe goes further. He says, since if he ceased speaking, they would return to absolute nothingness, like before the 6 days of creation. We must ask, what are they even now, when he is speaking them into existence? When God speaks a stone, or this table, or anything else into existence at every moment, what is the thing that he is speaking into existence? And the Alter Rebbe tells us that what it is nothing at all other than the words that are speaking them into existence. In other words, the creations themselves have no actual existence of their own. Their entire existence is the words of Hashem that are constantly creating them. And the way we said it in chapter 3 is that it's a process without a result. Right? Their existence is his constant act of making them exist, right? But they never actually achieve a state of actually existing, as we explained back in chapter 3. He is constantly making them exist, and that is all they are, is his constant making. There never actually concludes. Nothing ever pops out. And we explained how that must be because, right, it's a constant act of creation. It's not bringing a potential into an actuality like bringing a vessel out of silver, right? There is no existence, previous existence for them to bank on. Their entire existence is only him speaking them into existence at every moment.
That's listening to it now. That creates a bit of an issue.
Creates a lot of issues. Creates all the issues.
Okay. Because God is now outside of our system.
Yeah.
So how can he keep speaking it into existence because he's not in the same time frame? So now there's a...
Time frames are created.
Like a physical
time frames are also him just speaking them into existence.
But then he's not doing it all the time.
No, it's not really. It's not. The idea is not that he's within time. In other words, he doesn't have to be within time very conveniently, because chapter 2 and chapter 3, you're asking a question from a later chapter in a sense, because chapter 2 and chapter 3 really are working from the bottom up. In other words, we're not really concerned with whether God himself is in time, right? All we have to explain is why this rock is here. Right? So in other words, the Torah tells us that he speaks, and we're fine with that. He's constantly speaking, right? The fact that constantly speaking must at some point connect to a God who is totally above time, okay, you're right, that's a separate issue, but that's not what those chapters are concerned with at all. In fact, that's much more what our later chapters are concerned with than what those early chapters are concerned with. But a fair point. Anyway, so the metaphor he gives for the fact that the creation has absolutely no existence of its own, but is simply his act of creating it, right? Which is a different way of saying it is simply its source, right? All there is the source. The creation never attains a separate existence. The metaphor he gives is of the ray of the sun in the sun, right? And we explained, the sun shines out a ray. So the ray exists in two states. It exists outside of the sun, and it exists inside the sun. And it must exist in some way inside of the sun, because the sun is the only cause of the ray. I'm giving a very quick overview. Since the sun is the only cause of the ray, and the ray has no other causes whatsoever, therefore it cannot come into being outside of the sun, right? It has to begin within the sun in some form. So there's the ray as it is outside of the sun, and there's the ray as it is within its source. And we explained, but how is the ray within its source, within the sun? And we explained, really, it isn't, right? On the one hand, there has to be something of the ray inside the sun. On the other hand, how is it when it's inside the sun? The truth is, it's really just the sun there, right? There is no ray bouncing around inside the sun. There's no room for a ray to bounce around inside the sun. The sun is very full of other stuff. There's no light rays bouncing around in there, right? So therefore, what is the ray within the sun? Really, only the sun is there, right? There's no ray within the sun, which is the Alter Rebbe's entire point. Just as the ray, when it's in the sun, has no existence and is really just the sun shining. That's really all that's there. The sun is bahiri, right? It's shining, right, Ronnie?
Zorachat.
But he translates as bahiri, the Alter Rebbe says.
Bahiri?
Yeah.
Bahiri is in light.
Illuminated, it's lit up, whatever, however you want to say
light,
it.
Like there's dark blue and light blue.
Right, I understand. So the sun is light, whatever that means, right? It's bahiri. So you don't have light, you don't have a ray of light in the sun. You have the sun as it is bahiri, the sun as it is illuminated and shining, right? That's the Alter Rebbe's metaphor. Just as the ray in the sun does not really exist, the ray of the sun in the sun does not really exist, so too the creation, the stone, the wallet, whatever you wish, does not really exist. The only thing that the wallet is, right, is the sun itself, is the word of Hashem constantly bringing it into being. There is no actual wallet. There is only the word of Hashem which says wallet. Right? And that leads us to the immediate question of, if that's the case, why does there appear to be a wallet? And that's when the Alter Rebbe goes on and does chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. Right? That's the next question. So this metaphor was brought in chapter 3 to explain how there is no stone, there is only Hashem saying the word Evan. Right? And the stone itself is like the ray of the sun in the sun, where essentially there is just the sun. So too, the stone itself, there really is no stone. There's only Hashem speaking the stone into existence. That's what the metaphor was in chapter 3. So to sum up, what's the one-line summary of the metaphor in chapter 3? This is important because we're going to confuse things, because we're going to have a metaphor in chapter 10, which is different. The metaphor in chapter 3 was to say, what was the point of the metaphor? That's what I want you to remember. What was the point of the metaphor? It was to say that the creations are essentially nothing within their source. Right? All there is the source. There is no creation farzich, as we would say in Yiddish. There is no creation for itself. In itself, there is no creation. The creation is merely Hashem's bringing into existence of the creation. That makes sense, right? It never actually attains any sort of independence. That's what the metaphor was in chapter 3. Now we have another metaphor in chapter 10. As I said in our review, chapter 3 was part of Shaar HaYichud Ve'emunah, where we're explaining how everything is nothing. Here we are explaining something else. We're explaining how everything is something, and not just something, but the greatest something, how everything is one with Hashem. Now, these terms that we're using when we say everything and everything are far too broad, right? Everything is certainly not both. Everything is actually one or the other. Everything is either nothing, each thing is either nothing or something with a capital S, right? Tonight's class and this metaphor serve to make the distinction. We are going to separate everything out into either something or nothing. And the way we are able to do this is by looking closely at the way the Alter Rebbe's metaphor is different in chapter 10 and chapter 3. In chapter 10, there is a different sun and a different ray than there was in chapter 3. And by seeing the difference, we are going to understand profoundly the Alter Rebbe has two different ways of looking at two different categories of things. That's what we're going to do with the remainder of our class. Let's speak about a different metaphor for a moment, and then we'll begin to explain this one. A different metaphor for the nothingness of something within its source which is another metaphor brought in Chassidus, really for something else, not for this. It's a totally different thing that it's discussing there. But I just want to focus on the metaphor itself, the actual physical things. We're not even going to talk about what Chassidus is regular, what Chassidus says this normally describes. It really doesn't matter for our purposes. Let's just discuss the metaphor itself. The metaphor is the fire within the flintstone. I think we've spoken about it in this class at least once, right? You have a flintstone, which is literally a piece of rock. Nothing could be further from fire. Right? Where fire is hot, flintstone is cold. Fire is light, flintstone is dark. Right? It doesn't produce light. The flintstone can sit in a river for 1,000 years. You take it out of the river, you strike it, and fire comes out. Right? Literally fire comes out. You have a spark, heat, and light, and if you give it onto fuel, you can actually take fire out of the flintstone. Right? What is the difference between the fire in the flintstone and the ray of the sun in the sun? It shouldn't be too hard, by the way. It's an obvious difference.
This is potential and this is actual.
Say what you mean. Very good. Say good. You're saying good. Keep going. What do you mean?
The fire is not actually concealed in the stone. You have to bring it out. It has a potential to bring out.
But doesn't the fire come from the flintstone? You can't hit any rock and make fire. It's specifically the flintstone. So in some sense, the fire is in the flintstone. So keep going. So the fire is in the flintstone, but
it needs something else in order to be expressed.
Very good. It's not in. I'll say it in a different way. What you're saying. The fire is not in the flintstone as fire. Right? It is not in the flintstone as fire. The ray of the sun in the sun is in the sun as light, right? The sun itself is light. The flintstone is not like fire, right? So however the fire exists in the flintstone, it does not exist as fire, right? Which one of these two things, the ray of the sun in the sun or the fire in the flintstone, is more nothing within its source?
There's the fire and the flintstone.
Fire and fire.
Because it's
Which one is more one with its source?
That's the other one.
Sun.
Ray of the sun and the sun. The one that's more nothing in its source is the fire and the flintstone, because the truth is that the fire and the flintstone are really, let's put it this way. Why is it more nothing in its source, right? Why is it more nothing in it? Why is the fire in the flintstone seemingly more nothing than the ray of the sun in the sun?
Because the one is just being itself. It's doing what it is
If you're gonna-
right here.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Whereas in the flintstone, the stone just sits there, but it has to be acted upon to actually.
If
Fair
you're going to
point.
go into
Yeah.
the stone, you're not going to see fire.
Right.
If you're going to go into the sun, you're going to see light.
Right. So two very good points. Two very good points. The fire that's within the flintstone is what I'm trying to. Well, the fire that's within the flintstone is nothing. Right. It's nothing because there is no fire as fire in the flintstone. Right? It's not the same thing in the flintstone and outside of the flintstone, right? Clearly in the flintstone, it's not fire, right? Outside of the flintstone, it's fire,
But even
right? So when it's in the flintstone, it's really nothing within its source, right? It really doesn't exist as fire at all. On the other hand, what does that imply about the fire in the flintstone? It implies that really the fire and the flintstone are two separate things, right? It's tricky to wrap your mind around. It's almost paradoxical, right? On the one hand, the fire in the flintstone is nothing. There is no fire in the flintstone. There's only the flintstone. On the other hand, because fire and flintstone have nothing in common, really, it seems, in their properties, right? Fire and flintstone are really two separate things, right? What I am trying to point out is that bittul is the opposite of achdus, right? Being nothing is the opposite of being one. You can either be nothing in relation to your source, or you can be one in relation to your source. And even though when we talk about them, it's actually kind of difficult to keep them separate because they're two concepts which seem very close to one another, right? Because it's almost like to say you're one with something is almost like saying you're nothing other than that thing, right? On the other hand, these two things could not be more opposite than any two things can be. These are not the same thing. They are opposites, but they're very, very, in a very subtle way, at least when you compare them closely, but you see in what eventuates from them and what comes out, you see that they're opposites. The fire in the flintstone is nothing within the flintstone. The ray of the sun in the sun, at least in one way of explaining it, we'll get more into that in a minute, is something within the sun. And in fact is one with the sun. What is the essential metaphysical difference? In other words, how would you put your finger on the exact difference between the relationship of the flintstone to the fire and the sun to its light? The difference is that
maybe I'm too physical, but the fire doesn't come from the flintstone. I mean, that's rubbing the flintstones.
No, the fire.
With other stuff.
No, correct.
The fire.
No, correct. But
the
nevertheless,
fire doesn't depend on the flintstone.
but nevertheless, you can go around rubbing other things all day, but the fire doesn't come from the other things the way it comes from a flintstone. There's a reason a flint is used to start a fire and not other things, right? There's a certain potential for heat and light, which is fire, that exists within the flintstone, right? I agree that it's not a yeshma, and that's one of the reasons why the sun is a better metaphor, and the flintstone and the fire is not what's brought as by the Alter Rebbe as a metaphor, neither in chapter 3 nor in chapter 10. It's not a good metaphor for what we're discussing. I'm simply trying to bring it because there's at least two sources involved, and what we're describing is Hashem as the one source of everything, right? Just like the light to the sun, you only have one source, so it makes it much more sense, right? I'm just trying to bring out the difference more clearly between the way the fire exists in the flintstone, which certainly the flintstone has a certain potential, a certain ability to produce light and heat, and the way it exists in the sun. And to put your finger on the difference between them, the difference is essentially that the flintstone has an existence other than producing fire. The sun does not have an existence other than producing light. That's essentially the difference, right? At least in this interpretation of the ray of the sun in the sun. I don't want to overcomplicate things too fast. So we're going to treat this as the only interpretation. We'll talk about the other one later, okay? So you have the flintstone. The flintstone exists as a stone in a river for 1,000 years, right? That's its existence. It has another thing it can do, which really Darrell's point is brought out again, right? Because here again you see that there's a distinction between the flintstone. He's right, because the flintstone is only a source of fire when you hit it, right? So which is a different way of saying that the flintstone does not constantly exist as a source for fire. The flintstone has its own existence as a stone, and then under certain circumstances, in a certain way, fire can be brought forth from it, right? The sun... Sorry?
That's the equivalent of bringing something from nothing.
In some, it's really something from something, but yes, with some similarities to something from nothing. I agree. It's something from something, but with a big difference in the two somethings, I would say. The sun, on the other hand, exists to produce light. The sun does not have another job off on the side until something happens and then it starts shining, right? The sun is essentially a being that shines.
By default.
By default, it's what it is. It's not a question of whether you need an outside action or not is really just what we call the Gilui Milsa in Aramaic. It only shows on the essence of the thing, right? It's not the essence of the matter is not whether you have to come along and hit the flintstone or whether the sun does it by itself. The difference is really what is the inherent purpose and nature of this thing. And in the flintstone, there is a way to distinguish between the stone as a stone and the stone as a source of fire. In the sun, there is no means of distinguishing, Alter Rebbe wanted to say, between the sun as the sun and the sun as a source of light. In other words, the sun is a source of light. That's simply what the sun is. Unlike the flintstone, which is not simply a source of fire, right? Yes. The sun is simply a source of light. Now the question becomes like this. Or rather, the distinction is like this. In chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe talks about the sun like a flintstone. Again, in chapter 3, when the Alter Rebbe talks about the ray of the sun and the sun, he talks about it like a flintstone, right? What does he call it there? He calls it Guf Kadur HaShemesh, which means the body of the orb of the sun, right? In other words, he speaks of it as an object in which there is no room for light, and yet it produces light, right? Similar to how a flintstone is an object with no room for fire, and yet it produces fire, right? Now, the truth is that even these two things are not the same. The sun is still different than a flintstone. But the Alter Rebbe in chapter 3 speaks about the sun in a much more flintstone-like way. In other words, the Alter Rebbe's emphasis, let's put it this way, the Alter Rebbe's emphasis with this metaphor in chapter 3 is that the ray, when the ray of the sun is in the sun, it does not exist at all, right? It's totally bottled. All that's there is the sun. The same way, all that's in the flintstone is the stone, right?
Because there's nothing outside of the sun.
No, exactly, just like all there is the flintstone, right? So really the light is nothing, right? Which is the point of the metaphor. The point of the metaphor is to explain how the creation is nothing. There is simply the divine word speaking the creation into existence, right? In chapter 10, as we are about to read, he uses the exact same metaphor of the ray of the sun and the sun, and he means exactly the opposite thing. He means that the light is not nothing within the sun. The light in the sun is the sun. Again, it's not that there is no light in the sun, the way there is no fire in the flintstone, right? On the contrary, when the light is in the sun, the Alter Rebbe says in chapter 10, all there is the sun. The light is the sun, not there is no light. On the contrary, the opposite, the light is the sun. What's the difference? The difference is that in chapter 3 we were looking at the sun like a flintstone. We were saying the sun has an existence of its own, which is called Guf Kadur HaShemesh, the sun as an orb in the sky, right? And then it has a second property that it emits light. Here, as we will see now after this introduction, you will see it is explicit in the words of the Alter Rebbe. Here, we are talking about the sun as a source of light. That's the first difference between chapter 10 and chapter 3. Here, we are not talking about the sun as simply an object like the flintstone, which has the ability to produce light. In chapter 10, we are talking about the sun as a being of light. That's what the sun is. The sun is simply a source of light, and that is its entire existence. Therefore, when the light is within the sun, it's not nothing, right? Why does the fire in the flintstone have to be nothing? Because the flintstone has none of the properties of fire, right? The fire in the flintstone has to be nothing, because otherwise you'd have a hot and shining flintstone, right? The fire in the flintstone is nothing because it has to be a flintstone. But the light, when it's in the sun, doesn't have to be nothing. It doesn't have to be nothing because what is the sun? The sun is producing light. That's what the sun is. The sun's very being is a being that produces light. Where do we see that this is what the Alter Rebbe's emphasis is here? In these very words, it's actually at the end of the third line on 961. He says, Im guf hashemesh shenikra ma'or. With the body of the sun, which is called ma'or. Ma'or means, it comes from the word or, which means light. Ma'or means the one that produces light. The luminary, right? Nowhere in chapter 3 did the Alter Rebbe call the sun luminary. He just called the sun an object in the sky. Here, the Alter Rebbe calls the sun luminary. The emphasis is not on the sun as an object in which the light is nothing. It is an emphasis on the sun as a being of light. What is the sun? The sun is the thing which produces light. So when the light is within the sun, what's the difference between the light and the sun?
Nothing.
There's no difference. The light is the sun, not nothing. It's the sun. Right? The fire can't be the flintstone. It has to be nothing because the flintstone and fire have nothing in common. Right? But the light and the sun, not only do they have things in common, within the sun they are the exact same thing. They are one thing, which is called ma'or, which is called the source of the light. Kamesha Kasuv, as the Alter Rebbe goes on, fourth line of 961, Es ha-ma'or ha-gadol. Right? The Alter Rebbe brings a verse to show that the sun is called ma'or. The sun is called source of light, luminary. And the spark and the ray, which extends and shines forth from the sun, is called light. God called the light day, right? Our explanation explains why the Alter Rebbe even brings this pasuk. Very strange place to bring a verse, right? The Alter Rebbe is bringing a verse allegedly to tell us that light is called light, which is very strange, right? The Alter Rebbe is I'm letting you know that the thing which the sun shines is called light, right? Oh, wow. That's really, thank you for that. It's very illuminating. Illuminating, it's a pun. It's very thank you for illuminating us, Alter Rebbe. Right? And then even worse, right? The verse doesn't even seem to prove that idea. It doesn't say that light is called light. It says that light is called day, right? Which, what is day doing here? Day has nothing to do with our metaphor, it seems, right? So rather, why is the Alter Rebbe bringing the verse?
Part of the 7 days.
What? It is correct.
The day was created before night.
Correct. So the why is the Alter Rebbe bringing the verse here? The Alter Rebbe is bringing the verse to emphasize the point again, right? This is actually the second difference with chapter 3. The second difference with chapter 3. The first difference between the metaphor of the ray of light in the sun with the ray of the sun in the sun, the first difference between chapter 10 and chapter 3 is that the sun in chapter 10 is called ma'or. That was the first difference we said. The sun in chapter 10 is called luminary. So we are discussing not the nothingness of the light in the sun. We are discussing its achdus, its unity with Hashem, with its source, we should say rather. We'll get to the analog in a minute. We're still talking about the metaphor. We're talking about its unity with its source, with the sun. The second difference is that the Alter Rebbe brings a pasuk. He says, what is what is light? Light is what Torah calls day. day is light. What does that mean? What does it mean that day is light? It means that when do you call the light light? When it's outside of the sun, when it's shining, when it's making daytime. That is when light is called light. When is light not called light? When it's within the sun, right? Back in chapter 3, when it talks about the light in the sun, it says the light in the sun is called light. The only thing is that it doesn't exist, right? It's still light, but it doesn't exist. Why must it still be light? It must still be light because the sun and the light are two separate things. What else would you call it? It's the light, and the source of the light is in the sun. It happens to be that the source has no existence. The source is a non-being, right? The light in the sun does not exist. The light only begins to exist when it leaves the sun, right? But it's still light. It's light in the sun that doesn't exist, and it's light outside of the sun that exists, right? Here, the emphasis is different. Here in chapter 10, the Alter Rebbe is saying, when do you call the light light? Only when it's yom, only when it's outside of the sun, only when it's illuminating. What's it called when it's inside the sun? It's called ma'or. It's called the source of the light. When the light is within the sun, it's not even light. It's just the sun. Different than chapter 3. So again, to review, the two differences. The first difference between we can put it a different way. Both the source of the light and the light are different between chapter 3 and chapter 10. Those are the two things that are different. It's a different sun and it's a different light. In chapter 3, what is the sun? The sun is just a being which has no room for light in it. The same way a flint has no room for fire in it. Right? Here, what is the sun? The sun is the source of light, a being of light, a ma'or, a luminary. And in chapter 3, the light was called light both within its source and outside of its source. It was simply that within its source it didn't exist. Here, in chapter 10, the light is only called light outside of its source. Within its source, the light, there is no light. There is only the ma'or. Not there is no light in the way that there is no fire in the flintstone. That's nothingness. When we say there is no light here, we mean there is only the sun. We shouldn't say there is no light because it's too confusing. There is only the sun. Right? Or clearer even, the light is the sun. There is no distinction between the light and the sun. So we don't call it light. We don't call it light. We call it ma'or. We call it luminary. And that's why the Alter Rebbe brings the pasuk here. The pasuk is coming to tell us that even though you would think that how can the light as it's in the sun not even be called light, right? How can it be just the sun, right? The Alter Rebbe brings a verse to tell us that the Torah of truth calls the sun ma'or and the light day, right? It's only when it's day that it's called light. It's only when it's illuminating things outside of the sun, right, that it's called light. When it is within the sun, it's only ma'or. In other words, this metaphor is emphasizing the opposite of what the metaphor in chapter 3 emphasized. In chapter 3, we emphasized that the ray of the sun in the sun is nothing. Here we are saying the ray of the sun in the sun is the sun. The light is the sun.
Okay, so how does it go back to Chochmah?
Ha 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 ha. Ha! Let's read. Last line on page 961. When the light, let's see how the Alter Rebbe describes their existence, the nullification of the sun within the sun. How does it work? Or I should say the unity of the ray of the light within the sun. When the light is within its source, beguf hashemesh, within the sun itself, it is united with it, not nothing, right? It's united with it in the ultimate unity. Ki ein sham rak etzem echad. There is there only one etzem, only one self. There's not two things, right? Like there must be in the flintstone, where you have the stone and the potential to produce fire. In the sun, there is just the sun. One etzem, one self. Shu guf ha'ma'or ha'meir, which is the body of the luminary which is shining. Right? It is the sun which is shining. There is no separating between the sun and its shining. The sun is its shining. That's the etzem. Right? That's the one self. Guf ha'ma'or ha'meir. the shining luminary, right? Ki aziv shem because the ray and the light there is literally one self. It is one self literally with the body of the luminary that is shining. And it has no existence whatsoever of its own. So that's what the Alter Rebbe is, that's the metaphor, essentially. That's the metaphor. As Alter Rebbe is going to explain, let's do it outside now, and then God willing, next week we will read it inside. Let's do it outside now. And we'll give you the beautiful uftu, the beautiful, what's a uftu in Yiddish, Rani? What's a uftu? How do you translate uftu?
The punchline.
Yeah, you would say the accomplishment or the effect of this idea, right? Let's put it this way. In chapter 3, the light exists only to express the sun. The light exists only to express the sun. To what extent does the sun care that the light exists to express it? In chapter 3.
Nothing. Don't care.
It doesn't care, right? Why? Because the light is really of no metzius. The light really, it simply isn't, right? The sun is just the sun. It does its own thing. And light happens to come out, right? What should it matter to the sun? In chapter 10, the sun exists to shine. Therefore, not only is light important to it, it is light. That's what it is. Not even what it does, it's what it is. Now, let's talk about the nimshal. Let's talk about what this means. These two different things. In chapter 3, we are discussing the creation relative to its source, right? The creation relative to the words of Hashem that created, right? What do the words of Hashem care if the world is created from them, right? The answer is they care as much as the sun in chapter 3 cared about whether the ray of the sun is created from it. The answer is that they don't care. And why don't they care? Because all there is the words of Hashem. Nothing is actually created, right? It's just the words of Hashem speaking, and that is the creation, right? That's what we learned in chapter 3. In other words, the words of the word, there is no creation. Like I said before, there is no result to the process. There's just Hashem speaking. And Hashem speaking simply is, it simply produces to our eyes the creation, right? As we go on to explain in chapters 4, 5, and 6 about what our eyes see and how things appear to us and the tzimtzum, etc., right? At the end of the day, it's just the words of Hashem speaking, and what comes from the words of Hashem really has no existence. All it is those words, right? It's nothing. The creation is nothing. That was the whole point, remember? Remember we spoke about the throwing the rock up in the air? You remember that metaphor, right? The world is like a flying rock, right? And what's the key to a flying rock? There's no such thing as a flying rock, because rocks can't fly. Flying is simply an appearance that is imparted to a rock from the outside, right? And as long as the energy from your arm is making the rock fly, you can convince yourself there's a flying rock. But there's no such thing as a flying rock, really, right? It's a chidush. It's something, it's an innovation. It's something new. It's something that's being imposed constantly from the outside. That's the whole point of chapter 2 and chapter 3. Right? Chapter 2 and chapter 3 are saying that when I see that this wallet exists as a physical being, what is the truth of it? That is an appearance of a being that is constantly being imposed by Hashem speaking. What is it in and of itself? What is a wallet without the words of Hashem creating it? The answer is absolutely nothing. It has no being outside of the words of Hashem that created it. I see Ronnie doesn't like this, but you should have objected back in chapter 3.
The fact that God said wallet and not elephant means it means something to him.
Sorry?
It means something to him. That's why he didn't say elephant.
No. We're not talking about why Hashem decides to say what he says. We're saying the relationship of the creation to the word wallet is what we're describing. not its relationship to Hashem in general. We're describing the actual creation to its source, which is the words of Hashem that are constantly creating it. That's what we're discussing. Why Hashem chooses to say wallet, a different discussion. We're simply discussing the creation to its source, right? That's chapter 3. Chapter 3 says that the creation relative to its source is nothing. It has no being of its own. It is only the divine words which speak it into existence, right? Chapter 10 is discussing a different relationship. Not the creation to the divine words which create it, but the emanated divine wisdom to Hashem who emanates it, right? A different relationship. Not the relationship of the creation to the words of Hashem constantly speaking it into existence, but rather the relationship of his emanated traits, his emanated wisdom, or his emanated will, or his emanated kindness, to the God who emanates them, right? The same chachma, the same wisdom we were discussing in the previous chapter, right? That's what the Alter Rebbe is describing. What is the relationship of his emanated wisdom, of Sfiras HaChachma, Chachma of Atzilus, his emanated wisdom? What is the relationship of his emanated wisdom to him? And the answer is that the emanated wisdom is not nothing. On the contrary, what is it? It's him, right? Yeah. Just like the ray of the sun in the sun in chapter 10 is not nothing, but is rather the light is the sun, right? So too, Hashem's emanated wisdom is Hashem, the infinite Hashem who is above wisdom, right? That's the metaphor. The Alter Rebbe's metaphor here of the ray of the sun in the sun says that Hashem's emanated wisdom, what is it? It's not, even though it's like the ray of the sun in the sun, it's not nothing. On the contrary, it's the sun. It's everything, it's all of it. That is the difference. That is why chapter 10 has really a totally different metaphor, the opposite metaphor of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is about how the creation is nothing. What is chapter 10 about? It's about how Hashem's wisdom is something, right? And as I keep telling you, to really feel what we mean when we say Hashem's wisdom, you should always think of the Torah, because the Torah is Hashem's wisdom, right? So when we're talking here about Hashem's wisdom, right? Hashem's wisdom is absolutely united with Hashem. That doesn't mean the Torah is nothing. It means the Torah is everything, that Hashem put himself totally and completely within the Torah, right? The difference between these two metaphors, between the ray of the sun and the sun as nothing, and the ray of the sun and the sun as everything, can literally play out throughout Chassidus in the difference between how Chassidus tells us to treat the world and how Chassidus tells us to treat Torah. And it's two opposite ways, right? When Chassidus comes to telling us about the world, what does it always say? It says the world is nothing, right? The world has nothing of its own, right? Not that it's absolutely nothing, right? On the contrary, it's the ray of the sun and the sun, right? Not absolutely, it's not, we don't say the wallet doesn't exist. What do we say? We say, what is the wallet's entire existence? Only its source in godliness. That's what the wallet is, right? So in other words, worldly things, right? Why do we eat? We eat to have energy to do Torah and mitzvahs. Why do we work? We work so we have money to give to tzedakah, provide for a family, to do mitzvahs, right? What is the world? The worldly things, Chassidus tells us, are nothing other, right, than godliness. They have nothing to themselves other than godliness, right? So in other words, when a chassid looks at the world, when a follower of the Alter Rebbe looks at the world, and he's meant to look at the world in a chapter 3 mindset, right? This is what the world is. The world is like a ray of the sun in the sense that it's nothing other than its divine source, right? When we see anything in the world, what are we supposed to be thinking? We're supposed to be thinking, how can this be used for godliness? Why? Not because the world really exists and Torah is coming and telling us to ignore it, right? That's far too ugly for the Alter Rebbe's philosophy. The Alter Rebbe's thought is much more beautiful than that. The Alter Rebbe says, when you look at a physical thing or any creation and you're looking for its godly purpose, what are you doing? You're literally looking for the only thing about that creation that's actually real. right? That is the reality of this creation. Everything else about it, right, is just tzimtzum, hester, concealment, and nothingness, right? Everything else about it is absolutely nothing. Its only reality is its source in godliness, right? That's what we say about the world. Chapter 3 mindset. What do we say about Torah? Chapter 10 mindset. What does a follower of Alter Rebbe say about Torah? The exact opposite. Just as in the world, when you encounter something in the world, you're supposed to look at the thing itself as nothing, and everything exists only for a divine purpose, right? When you look at Torah, it's the exact opposite. Torah does not exist. What purpose does Torah exist for? Torah exists for the purpose of Torah. That's what Torah is for. Right? Why? Because Torah and Hashem are absolutely one. Right? What does Hashem exist for? Ridiculous question. If Hashem existed for something, he wouldn't be Hashem. Right? The exact same thing is true about his chachma, about his wisdom. Right? Which is why Chassidus says the Torah is not to make the world a civilized place or to have a better society. Right? The Torah is not a guidebook for life, right? It's not a manual for navigating through your day-to-day life, right? What is the Torah? The Torah is the Torah. Why should I do mitzvahs? Not to be a better person or make the world a better place, at least in the simple understanding of doing something nice, that there should be nice things in the world or whatever, or to civilize the world, make it more civilized, right? That's not why you do a mitzvah, according to Alter Rebbe. On the contrary, that's making from Hashem's chachma human chachma, right? That's to say, Hashem's wisdom is like human wisdom. What is Hashem's wisdom really? It's the ray of the sun in the sun, not as a nothingness, but as an absolute unity with Hashem. When you put on tefillin, right, that is a direct experience of godliness, not a limited experience. It is an experience of the godliness that precedes the tzimtzum, right? It precedes the divine self-contraction. Right? When the Torah tells you something, the Torah tells it to you, even though on the surface it may appear like human wisdom, the Torah tells you something, it is literally an expression of God. We say that Anoichi, the first word of the Ten Commandments, is Reisha Tevis, Ana Nafshi Ksavis Yavis. Right? I've written myself down and given myself over. Right? That's what the Torah is. That's what Hashem's Chachma is. What?
It's an Egyptian word.
What?
Anochi.
That's what the Torah is. That's what the Torah is. So when we say Hashem's wisdom is like the ray of the sun in the sun, it's totally different than when we say the world is like a ray of the sun in the sun. It's opposite perspectives. Chapter 3 is saying the world is nothing. When you look at the world, you look for the godly source within it, the godly source that creates it, because that's the only reality it has. When it comes to the Torah, don't look for other things. When it comes to Hashem's wisdom and Hashem's spheres, right, Hashem's emanated traits, don't look for other things and ulterior motives and the inner reasons for Hashem's wisdom, right? On the contrary, you're standing on hallowed ground, right? Take off your sandals. Take off your sandals when you learn the Torah, because what is the Torah? What is the Torah and its mitzvahs? The Torah and its mitzvahs is like the ray of the sun in the sun. The ray of the sun in the sun means that all there is here is the sun. The Torah is godliness. The Torah is absolutely one with Hashem, and you can no more separate the Torah from Hashem than you can separate the sun from shining. Right? So we have chapter 10 and chapter 3, two different suns, two different lights, and really they are absolutely different. Chapter 3 is about the world. Chapter 10 is about Hashem's wisdom, Hashem's traits, Torah, if you wish to call them by that name. Right? And not only are they not nothing, they are one with the ultimate something.
But they both coexist at the same time.
What do you mean?
Chapter 3 and chapter 10.
They're about two different things. That's what I was trying to point you out. It's not a paradox. It's literally about two different things, right? There's one group of things which are nothing, and there's one group of things which are Hashem. And then with separation there's the Nivroim, creations, and the Netzalim, the emanations, profoundly different. It's the difference between his emanated wisdom, his emanated traits, and the created world as we see around us. Fundamentally different. It's not, they're both true at the same time because they apply to two different realities, right? So as we go on in chapter 10, we're going to learn more about this unity and about this metaphor itself. We're going to talk about various different things, but it's very important to keep in mind that when we say the ray of the sun in the sun in chapter 10, we mean not just different than in chapter 3, but literally the opposite. We'll continue next week, God willing.
Shkoyach.